It begins with the smell of wood smoke. Not from a fire, not today. It's late spring and too warm for that. But from memory folded somewhere in the soft tissue of my chest. The way scent clings to time, pulling it forward like a thread unspooling from a frayed sleeve. I am standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out the last of the breakfast tea, and the window is open to a breeze that smells faintly of lilacs and freshly turned soil. And something else. Something older. Mark is in the garage, I think. Or maybe in his study where the curtains never quite open all the way. After nearly 40 years of marriage, his habits are as familiar as the rise and fall of my own breath. I don't need to look to know where he is. I don't need to ask. That's how things have always been with us, steady, predictable, quiet, too quiet sometimes. We live in a modest house on the edge of town, tucked between tall hedgerows and a garden I've cultivated like a secret. I've spent decades with my hands in the dirt, coaxing beauty out of silence. The roses bloom a little less each year, but I still go out and speak to them. Perhaps because I need something to listen. Something that doesn't answer. I'm 62 now, and it isn't that I'm unhappy, no. That's not it. Happiness just stopped being loud. It became a hum in the background, like the sound of the dryer turning or the clock ticking in the hallway. You learn to live with it. You learn not to expect the crescendo. So when the phone rang that morning, it startled me more than it should have. The sound fractured the calm, slicing through it with a kind of urgency that had long been foreign to our home. I dried my hands on the hem of my apron and answered. "Melinda," said the voice. Warm. Familiar. Too familiar. It was Alan, my husband's colleague of over 30 years. Widower. Thoughtful eyes. A man who always took a moment too long before answering, as though every sentence required pilgrimage. I hadn't spoken to him in months. "I was wondering," he began, and there was something in the cadence that made me grip the receiver tighter, "if you might want to take a walk sometime. Nothing formal. I'd like to talk." There was a pause. A pause long enough for 1,000 small decisions to bloom and die in the space between heartbeats. I said yes. Not because I was searching for anything. Not because I was lonely, not truly. I said yes because something in me stirred. The part that once remembered wood smoke and wet pine needles on the hem of my coat. The part that still dreamed in color. That afternoon I changed my blouse twice before settling on the soft linen one. The blue that Mark once said matched my eyes. I told him I was meeting a friend, and he nodded, eyes not leaving the newspaper. It wasn't a lie. Not entirely. As I stepped out into the warm hush of the day, I felt it, a faint crack in the stillness I'd long mistaken for peace. A whisper, low and persistent, that perhaps there was more to be lived. Not louder, but deeper. He was already there when I arrived, Alan, leaning against the wrought iron railing near the entrance of Halcyon Park, the way he always had, a posture that blended patience with a kind of thoughtful melancholy. He held a paper coffee cup, though it looked more like a prop than anything he had interest in drinking. When he saw me, his eyes lit, not in the way that causes a woman to recoil, but in that rare, quiet way that feels like being remembered. "Melinda," he said, almost like an exhale. The way he said my name surprised me. Not because it was unfamiliar. He'd said it dozens of times over the years at work functions, holiday dinners, the occasional summer barbecue, but because this time it was just for me. Not tied to Mark or introductions or shared company. Just me. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone said my name like that. Without context. Without apology. We started down the park's gravel path, the sound of our steps softened by the pale dust. The trees had only just come into their full leaves, and the filtered sunlight dappled across the path like soft lace. I could smell the tender green of new life, mingled with the subtle rot of wet bark and the sweet scent of violets hidden low in the grass. "I used to walk this path with Susan," Alan said, his voice as hushed as the breeze. "Especially in spring. She loved the forsythia. Always said they reminded her of her mother's garden. I nodded slowly, unsure whether to speak or simply listen. Grief, I found, doesn't need conversation, it only needs room. I don't mean to make this about her, he added, glancing sideways. I asked you here for a reason. We stopped near a wooden bench overlooking a shallow pond. The water was still, except for the skimming of two dragonflies tracing their invisible frenetic geometry. He sat, and I joined him, careful not to brush too close. Yet even in our polite distance I felt something. A warmth. A thread. I saw you last month, he said, eyes on the pond. At the retirement party. You were standing near the window, holding a glass of wine you hadn't touched. I don't think anyone else noticed. I flushed, surprised by the specificity. I wasn't feeling very social. I know, he said. Then, after a beat, you looked far away. I almost laughed. Not from amusement, but recognition. I suppose I felt far away for a while now. Alan didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket, a small note card. He handed it to me wordlessly. It was a sketch. Pencil. Rough but elegant. It was of a woman, myself, unmistakably standing by a window, wine glass in hand, looking out toward something unseen. There was a delicacy to the lines, a reverence in the way the light kissed the edge of my face. You drew this? I whispered, throat tightening. I've taken to sketching lately, he said quietly. It helps me remember things as they are. Or as they feel. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of hyacinths and something faintly metallic. I stared at the sketch, overcome by a feeling I couldn't name. It wasn't desire, not exactly. Nor flattery. It was being seen. Truly seen. And I hadn't realized until that moment how very long it had been. I kept the sketch. Folded it carefully, slipping it into the shallow pocket of my cardigan like it was something fragile, almost sacred. Neither of us said much after that. We sat for a while longer, listening to the hush of the wind through the trees, the faint sound of children playing somewhere in the distance. Then we parted with a quiet nod, no promises, no plans. Just a shared silence that stretched between us, oddly comforting. Back home, the day resumed its familiar rhythms. Mark was in the garage, oiling the hinges on the side gate, something that had been squeaking for weeks, but only now, after some internal cue, had become urgent. I stood at the edge of the porch, watching him for a moment, his movements efficient and focused. He didn't see me. And I didn't call out. I went upstairs instead, sat by the window of our bedroom with the folded sketch resting on my lap. Outside, the sun was lowering itself gently into the horizon, casting a golden pink hue over the neighborhood. It was beautiful, but it felt far away, like I was watching it through a pane of glass that time had slowly thickened. I tried not to look at the drawing, but my fingers betrayed me, unfolding it once more. The woman in the sketch. She looked like me, yes, but more than that, she looked like someone I used to be. Someone whose thoughts hadn't been muffled by years of routine and small, quiet compromises. There was longing in her stance, but also alertness. A softness still lit from within. I wondered if Alan had drawn what he saw, or what he imagined. I wondered if there was a difference. Later that evening, Mark and I ate dinner side by side, the television murmuring softly from the living room. Some nature documentary neither of us really watched. He told me about the lawn mower, about the neighbor's new shed, about an old friend from the office who'd finally retired to Arizona. I nodded, smiled in the right places, even reached for his hand once across the table. He gave it to me, but absent-mindedly, I still on the screen. And I thought, not for the first time, how strange it was to love someone, truly love them, and yet feel your presence vanish slowly from their field of vision. That night in bed, I lay awake long after Mark's breath turned to the slow rhythm of sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts wandering not to Alan exactly, but to the woman he'd seen through his pencil. The woman I might still be. The question began to form then, quiet, insistent. Who am I when no one is looking? And what would it mean to be looked at again, not just out of habit, but with attention, with curiosity, with care? The days that followed passed in slow domestic rhythms. Laundry folded in soft stacks. Tea brewed mid-morning, sweetened with honey. Mark and I moved around each other like familiar furniture, pleasant, functional, worn smooth with time. And yet, something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in the quiet moments, like a current beneath still water, barely visible but undeniably there. I thought of Alan more than I should have. Not in the way a younger woman might think of a man, with heat and urgency, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. A presence that visited me during small tasks, while shelling peas into a bowl, or wiping the dust from the top of the mantel. I would wonder what he was doing. Whether he still walked the path through Halcyon Park. Whether he thought of me. It was a Tuesday morning when I saw him again. I hadn't expected it. I was at the town library returning a stack of novels, books I had devoured but barely remembered. I liked the way libraries smelled, like worn pages and forgotten conversations. There was a stillness to them, a reverence like entering a small cathedral of stories. I had just placed the books in the return bin when I turned and found him. Alan. Standing in the biography aisle, a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder, one hand resting on the spine of a book about Georgia O'Keeffe. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing the thin, pale skin of his forearms, delicate and strong, like tree limbs in early spring. He looked up, and for a moment, the space between us stilled. No words. Just recognition. A shared surprise. And then, unmistakably, warmth. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, a little breathless. He smiled gently. "I come here often. Old habits die hard." I hesitated, then stepped closer, unsure of myself. Unsure of what this was, what it might be becoming. "Any good finds today?" He lifted the O'Keeffe biography slightly. I always liked how she painted loneliness. Not as something tragic, but as something vast. I nodded, swallowing something unspoken. I always thought she looked like she knew a secret. She probably did. A silence bloomed between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. Like the pause between verses in a poem. "I meant what I said, Melinda," he said at last, lowering his voice. "That day in the park. You deserve to be seen. And not just in passing." The words pressed against my skin like a touch. "I'm not sure I know how to be seen anymore," I admitted quietly. "It's easier to be useful. Predictable. Safe." Alan tilted his head slightly. "Safe is not the same as whole." I didn't know how to answer. The part of me that had folded itself neatly into Mark's world wanted to protest, to defend the life I built. But another part, quieter but growing, simply listened. "I should go," I said, though I didn't want to. He nodded, not pressing. "May I walk you out?" We stepped outside into the sharp sunlight, the sky stretched in clean blue above us. I didn't know what it meant, this connection. I didn't know if it was wrong or just unexpected. All I knew was this. As we stood at the curb, Alan looked at me in a way no one had in years, not as a wife, or a woman past a certain age, or someone's plus one, but as if I were unfolding in real time, full of pages still to be read. And that look stayed with me long after I turned the corner and walked home alone. That evening I watched Mark from the doorway of the den. He sat in his usual chair, slippers on, television murmuring. A documentary about bridges or maybe boats, something full of slow narration and sweeping aerial shots. He didn't notice me standing there. I used to love that about him, his complete immersion in things. It had felt like stability. Now it felt like distance. I made 2 cups of tea and brought one to him, placing it gently on the side table. He looked up and smiled faintly, the way someone smiles at the return of a predictable kindness. "Thanks, love," he said, and turned back to the screen. I wanted to say something then. Not about Alan. Not even about us. Just something real. But the words crowded too tightly in my chest, tangled with years of unspoken need. So I sat beside him in the other chair, hands wrapped around my own mug, and tried to feel present. The television flickered shadows across the wall. Mark cleared his throat once, then twice. I thought maybe he would say something too. But he didn't. Later, as I folded clothes in the bedroom, I pulled open the drawer where I kept scarves and gloves. The sketch was still there, tucked beneath the lavender sachet. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the crease with my thumb. The paper had taken on the faint scent of crushed petals and linen. The woman Alan had drawn looked almost unfamiliar to me now, so still, so observant. Like someone who had paused in the middle of disappearing. I remembered something my mother once said, long before the gray settled into her temples. You can live a whole life beside someone and still feel like a window he never looks through. I hadn't understood her then. I thought she'd been speaking in metaphor, some poetic exaggeration born from melancholy. But now I knew. The next morning I rose early before Mark. The light had barely reached the tops of the hedges outside, and the house was bathed in the blue hush of dawn. I wrapped myself in a shawl and stepped outside into the dew-soaked garden. The air smelled like lilac and damp earth. I moved slowly along the flower beds, touching leaves, brushing my fingertips across the petals of tulips still curled against the cool. Gardening had always been where I felt most myself, no mask, no expectations. Just quiet life responding to quiet care. Alan's voice returned to me, safe is not the same as whole. I knelt down near the rosebush, one I'd been coaxing back to health since last fall, and studied its new buds. Tiny, stubborn, pale. They reminded me of something unspoken pressing up through the surface of a life. Fragile, yes, but undeniable. Something inside me ached, not from loss exactly, but from absence. The kind that settles so slowly you don't know it's there until someone says your name with meaning. Until someone looks at you as if they're listening. As I stood to go inside, I felt the pull of something I hadn't felt in years, not toward a person, but toward a question. Who might I be if I stopped tending only to what others needed? It rained for 3 days after that. Soft, persistent April rain that soaked the ground and made the sky hang low like a wet sheet. The garden puddled in its corners, the rosebuds bowed under the weight. I stayed mostly indoors, drifting from room to room as though the walls had begun to echo. I found myself lingering in the guest bedroom, a space rarely used, neat and hushed like a museum of other people's visits. There was an old writing desk beneath the window, one I hadn't sat at in years. I pulled the chair out, wincing at the slight creak, and sat. My reflection in the glass faintly merged with the trees outside, a strange double exposure. I couldn't tell if I looked older than I remembered, or just more honest. On a whim, I pulled out the drawer and found a stack of old letters tied with string. Most were from the early years, Mark's notes from business trips, birthday cards, even a few love poems. I untied the bundle and read them slowly, each word soft with time. One note caught my eye. I unfolded it carefully. It was short. Fewer than 50 words. Mark had written it during our 3rd year of marriage. You make everything feel gentle. I didn't know life could feel like that. Come home soon. I miss your voice. I stared at the sentence. I miss your voice. Had he meant it? Or had it simply been the natural affection of a younger man still learning the shape of marriage? I touched my throat lightly as if trying to remember what that voice had sounded like. When had I stopped using it for anything but logistics, dinners, appointments, polite affection? There was a knock at the front door later that day. A soft, tentative rhythm. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mark was out with his weekly chess group at the rec center. When I opened the door, Alan stood there, umbrella folded and dripping onto the porch. I'm sorry to come unannounced, he said. I was walking past in. I don't know, I just wanted to see if you were all right. His eyes searched mine, cautious. May I? I nodded, stepping aside. We sat in the kitchen, the kettle humming between us. I poured tea into mismatched mugs, the steam curling upward like something alive. I've been thinking, he said, wrapping his hands around the ceramic, about what it means to age. I looked at him curious. We spend our younger years building careers, homes, identities, and then suddenly we're here. At the edge of it all. And no one tells you that the scaffolding starts to creak. That you might wake up one morning and not know if the life you built still fits. I felt tears prick at the back of my throat. Not from sadness exactly, but from recognition. I used to think aging was a quiet retreat, I said softly. Now I wonder if it's actually an invitation. To return to yourself. Alan smiled, but it was a tired smile. A knowing one. That's the hardest journey of all. We sat in silence for a long time after that. The rain tapping the windows. Our hands near but not touching. His presence didn't demand anything from me, and that, more than anything, undid me a little. Before he left, he turned at the door and said, "You don't have to disappear, Melinda. Not yet. Not ever." And then he stepped back into the rain. I stood there long after he'd gone, watching the empty space where he'd been, the soft puddle where his shoes had rested. A strange ache bloomed in my chest, not desire, not even loneliness. Just the quiet awareness that someone had truly looked at me and listened. And in that moment, I realized something simple and terribly profound. I miss being known. It's astonishing how little things begin to shift once you start listening to yourself, Not the surface voice that manages the household or replies politely at dinner, but the one that lives underneath. The one that sighs when no one hears, that longs when no one is looking. I started noticing how often I filled silence with movement. I'd clean the kitchen again after Mark had gone to bed, even when everything was spotless. I'd rearrange books on the shelf by color, by size, by some invisible logic I didn't fully understand. It wasn't restlessness. It was a defense against stillness, against noticing. One night, as I was wiping down an already clean counter, Mark looked up from his paper and said, "You've been quiet lately." The words startled me. Not because they weren't true, but because I didn't know he was paying attention. I dried my hands slowly. "Have I?" He folded the paper in his lap. "Just a little more, far away." I searched his face. There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Just confusion. Like a man realizing he'd misplaced something but couldn't name what. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer him some version of the truth, but the words caught in my throat. How do you explain an ache that's not really about anyone? How do you say, "I don't know who I've become," without it sounding like blame? Instead I said, "I've just had a lot on my mind." Mark nodded as if that answered something. And perhaps it did. But the distance remained. Me on one side of the evening. Him on the other. That weekend I found myself walking the halcyon path again. Alone this time. The trees had thickened since the last time I'd been, their leaves a deeper green, the ground littered with petals already fallen. I moved slowly, letting the quiet press in. There was a comfort in it, but also a disquieting clarity. I sat on the same bench Alan and I had shared, the pond glassy and still before me. I didn't expect to see him. That wasn't why I was there. I simply needed the place. The stillness. A room without walls. As I sat, I thought of the sketch again. The way he'd seen me standing at that window. And I began to wonder, was it possible that someone else's gaze had reminded me of my own? Not long after, I returned home to find a note slipped beneath the garden gate. My heart fluttered, a schoolgirl's heart in an old woman's chest. I picked it up gently. It was from Alan, written in his careful, slanted script. "You once told me you felt like a window no one looked through. I hope you know your light still shines through it, whether or not anyone sees." I read it 3 times. Then tucked it into my apron pocket next to the sketch I'd folded and unfolded too many times to count. That evening I stood at the kitchen window, watching the dusk settle across the garden. Mark was outside, adjusting the bird feeder, whistling faintly through his teeth. And I wondered, had I ever told him I loved the way he did that? Or had I too stopped seeing him? There was a question rising in me now. A more dangerous one. Not who am I, but what if we both stopped looking too soon? The following morning I woke before dawn. Not to the alarm, not to birdsong, but to the weight of a thought that had followed me from sleep. I wanted to paint again. I hadn't in years. Not since the children were young, when finger paint and nap schedules left little room for oils and canvas. My easel had been folded and tucked into the attic, its wood drying into forgetfulness. But the thought of it now stirred something like finding a locked door in your own house and remembering you used to have the key. After Mark left for work, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air was heavy with dust and silence and the faint scent of cedar. I found the easel behind a stack of holiday boxes, leaning like an old friend who had waited too long. It was heavier than I remembered, the joint stiff, but I carried it down anyway into the guest room, the only space untouched by years of routine. I opened the window wide and let in the pale morning light. It felt like breathing for the first time in weeks. I didn't paint right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank canvas. The emptiness of it scared me a little. It had no history, no expectation. Just a quiet permission. When I finally dipped the brush in color ochre first, then pale violet, I felt a shiver along my spine. The motion was slow, uncertain, but real. I wasn't painting anything in particular. I just needed to move to make something that hadn't existed before I began. That afternoon, as the light shifted into something gold and long, Mark knocked lightly on the doorframe. I hadn't even heard him come in. He stood there, arms crossed loosely, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know you still painted," he said softly. "Neither did I replied, not looking up. He stepped into the room slowly, I scanning the easel, the brushes, the palette smeared with quiet decisions. "I remember the painting you did of the willow tree," he said. "You hung it above the fireplace in our first house." I nodded, startled by the memory. I hadn't thought he'd noticed. We were quiet for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You've seemed different lately. Like you're searching for something." I met his eyes then. They were the same eyes I'd known for most of my life, gentle, steady, but now they held something else too. Maybe it was concern. Or maybe it was the beginning of a question he didn't know how to ask. "I think I am," I admitted. He sat on the edge of the bed, not too close. "Is it something I can help you find?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. "I don't know. Maybe?" He nodded as if that was enough for now. "Well," he said, glancing back at the canvas, "you were always good at beginnings." That night, we ate dinner together more quietly than usual. But something was different, not the silence, but the way we sat inside it. Less like strangers, more like people relearning the language of presence. Afterward, he reached for my hand without thinking. I let him. His skin was warm, familiar. And I wondered, not for the first time, if long marriages were not held together by passion or duty, but by the courage to start over in the same room. The next week unfolded like a held breath. Every day I returned to the guest room, now my little studio, painting not from vision but from instinct, color where there should be shape, emotion where there should be logic. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't even trying to understand myself. I was simply showing up. One afternoon, as a soft rain began to fall, I painted a single figure, a woman, standing at the edge of a shoreline. Her back to the viewer, hair loose in the wind. There was nothing dramatic in her posture, nothing overt. But something in the way she leaned forward, ever so slightly, suggested a choice was being made. A turning. Or return. When I stepped back, I realized I was trembling. Not with fear exactly, but recognition. The figure was me. Later that day, I received a letter in the mail. Real paper, real ink. It was from Alan. He wrote sparingly, no embellishments, no dramatic flourishes. Just a few lines that felt like stone dropped into still water. "I hope you are painting again. Whatever comes next, Melinda, I'm grateful. Not for what might have been, but for what you reminded me I still am." There was no return address. No invitation. Just the closing of a chapter that had never fully opened. I sat at the kitchen table, letter trembling in my hands, when Mark walked in. He paused when he saw me. I must have looked startled, too exposed. He didn't ask what the letter said. Instead, he poured 2 cups of tea, set one beside me, and pulled out the chair across from mine. "I've been thinking," he said, fingers curled around his mug, "that maybe I stopped asking who you were somewhere along the way. I don't know when. Maybe after the kids left. Maybe even before." His voice was low, almost ashamed. "I always thought we were fine," he continued. "We had our routines. We laughed. We traveled. But I see now, maybe I mistook comfort for closeness." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The tears welled quietly, not from hurt, but from the unexpected relief of being seen even now. "I don't want to lose you," he said simply. "Not to someone else. Not even to yourself." At that, I reached for his hand. "You never lost me," I whispered. "But I think I might have misplaced myself. And I need to find her again. Not because I'm leaving, but because I want to stay. As me." We sat like that for a long while. Fingers entwined. The rain ticking steadily against the windows like a clock that no longer threatened. I didn't tell him about the letter. Not because it was a secret, but because it no longer held weight over my choices. It had done what it came to do. It had opened a door inside me I didn't know was locked. And now I stood on its threshold, not with fear, but with the quiet knowing that I could choose. Not between men. Not between past and present. But between living half asleep and waking up. It was early evening, the sky softening into lavender, when I stood before the mirror in the guest room. The window was open, curtains lifting like breath. My painting of the woman at the shoreline leaned against the wall, still wet in places. I studied her one last time, not as a creation but as a witness. I recognized the tilt of her shoulders now, not hesitation, but readiness. The wind in her hair no longer a symbol of being lost, but of possibility. Behind me, the house was quiet. Mark was in the den, flipping through an old album of our travels. I could hear the faint scratch of pages turning, the occasional pause when he lingered on a memory. We had begun carefully to revisit each other. Not the versions we had preserved like keepsakes, but the fuller, messier selves that had changed in the margins. That night at dinner, I asked him a question I hadn't dared in years. Do you think we could start something new? Not just go back, but forward. Together. Mark looked at me, fork paused midair. For a moment he said nothing. Then, I don't know what that looks like. Neither do I replied. But I meant it not as doubt but as invitation. After we cleared the dishes, we didn't retreat to separate rooms as we often did. Instead, we sat on the living room couch, a little stiff at first. Then slowly as the hours drew on and the lamps cast a gentler glow, we softened into presence. We talked not about the bills or the neighbors or the grandchildren, but about books, about dreams we once had, about a place in Ireland we never visited and maybe still could. When I went upstairs, I didn't fold away the painting or tuck away the brushes. I left them out. And I left the light on. Not because I was working, but because I intended to return. Later, as I stood at the window brushing my hair, I caught my reflection again, older, yes, but clearer somehow. As though a film had lifted. The years had not erased me. They had simply buried me under devotion, under gentleness, under the kindness of being needed. And now I had begun the slow, patient work of uncovering. Alan's absence no longer felt like a longing. It felt like a ripple that had passed through and moved on, leaving me awake in its wake. Mark came to bed quietly. We didn't speak. He simply reached for my hand beneath the blanket, and I let him. His touch wasn't an answer. It was a beginning. And I, for the first time in years, met it not as a duty, not as a habit, but as a woman with her eyes open. A woman stepping not away from the life she knew, but deeper into it. And somewhere within, the shoreline woman turned. And she walked forward. Into herself. Into the light.